Brolin, thank you so much for joining. I really truly appreciate you coming on the podcast. And I guess we're this is our first podcast. So as we're going through this, we're really trying to figure it out as we go. So thank you for being open to that. And the first question I want to start asking people is, what's a moment within sports that you're proud of?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Cole. It's truly an honor to be on the first podcast and, to have a chat with you again and see how life is going. And just to answer your question, what is that moment for me that I could say I was proud of within my sport? I would have to first describe what the sport is. And for the last decade and a half, my sport of choice has been snowboarding, both at a leisure level and at an extreme professional level, competing, filming, traveling and whatever encompassing that. And I'd say the biggest moment that I saw that I would truly say I was proud of was about a couple years back, I think right before COVID, as I was trying to traject towards qualifying for China. It was the moment when I signed with Burton. And for us, Burton is one of the biggest brands. It's like beyond Red Bull, beyond all the recognizable brands in the world. Burton is our Nike, and to have the recognition that your own peers see a value in you, not just as a snowboarder, but the legacy that you're being able to pave, the work that you've been putting in, um, all come together and be invited into a world-class team and a world-class uh, brand was really that moment of like, wow, I did something for myself and I was able to turn a fear into a strength.
Yeah, incredible. I know a little bit about Burton just from, I guess, being snowboard adjacent. I haven't snowboarded a ton in my life, but incredible that you were able to make it to that point. And I'd love to get into your snowboarding career, but I also wanted to back it up a little bit too to when you and I first met, which was when we were in fifth grade and you had come to the US. And I'd love to hear just about how that happened. That, you born in Uganda and up until that point, how you ended up coming to Lincoln, Massachusetts.
Yeah, I mean, such a tribute story and a really pivotal change within my arc of existence. When I was younger, having had war around the surrounding countries that I was in, I'm Ugandan by birth and obviously by, I guess, culture. But what ended up bringing us together and the story that we get to share at the beginning of my American story was when I was younger, my mother lived in Boston, Massachusetts. And through that, she had worked for a lady, various clients. She's a hospice nurse, or more like your in-home aid nurses. And during that journey of hers, she met a lady named Susan Mygat, where she was able to share her story of how she came to America and while their paths were crossing, my name was mentioned and my sister's as well, and kind of the stage that we were at and our mother's lives and where we were. And through passing and through multiple conversations, and obviously my mom did a wonderful job with a bunch of our clients and gaining a good reputation. She sorted out help in gaining both green cards and visas, and the whole process of how to bring her kids. So in fifth grade, we're reunited with our mother, and I personally got to see my mother for the first time within my lifetime that I could understand,
Wow.
studying about the age of 11 and a half. So that's how you and I get to hang out, and that's just my Lincoln journey.
Yeah. So I didn't realize that. So your mother came over first. How old were you when your mom came to the US?
From what I believe, my mother left when I was 1.5. So,
Uh,
before I could recognize she had taken the opportunity to leave shortly after, I think a year and some change that when I was born, she also gained the opportunity to go to America and took that opportunity.
wow. And so were you like in constant contact with your mom at that point? That was a long time ago. So the internet was different. Communication wasn't as simple, I would imagine.
I mean, talk about a change of times. These days, we could just be on a phone and just FaceTime each other or just shoot a text. Back then, I think the whole idea was, especially as a child, you get both a mixture of fairy tale and an our story of who your mother was, of who she is, and the idea of her. And you almost live in that vague state of, you had a mother, somebody brought you into this life, but you might never see your mother again. I think the community also had accepted around where she had come from that like maybe we'll not get to see her again. Really the circumstances like you mentioned of not being able to communicate and not stay in touch. So we did not as a family, at least as the family she had left at the moment, we had zero contact or idea that where she was. It was a bunch I wouldn't say it was a bunch of rumors, but it was a speculation of where did she end up.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then Susan and her meet, was it her that reached back out to you? Did you like get in contact and you had this idea that you were going to be coming to the US and it was a process?
I wish it was that easy. Personally, I had no contact with her. And I think my sisters had limited contact. I do remember my oldest sister would have periodic times where she would get a phone call from the neighbor and she would have to go to the neighbor's house. Hey, your mother is cold. She wants to talk to you. And, my mom was very, very clever and kind and in the way she was able to keep in touch with her kids. Because obviously in the African culture, you leave a household, you leave kids. Obviously, your partner's not going to be as happy. Energy and the synergy of communication gets cut off a bit. So it was always just kind of like mysterious. And the day I actually got to leave to come to America, in my understanding, especially as a young kid at that time, I was 10 and a half. I thought I was getting kidnapped. And I did not realize I was coming to America until I got to America and, I was told, hey, this is America and this is your mother.
What do you mean you thought you were getting kidnapped?
How well, coming from poverty, we barely had running water in the house. We barely had
Wow.
electricity in the house. To hearing the idea that you're going to go on a plane, that it's not like we grew up on a lot of TV. I think until I was like 9, we didn't have access to TV, and when we did, that TV was like local news, local projections of what our father wanted to see when he got home. But that was it. So somebody telling you, "Hey, you're gonna go on a plane and you're gonna fly to America," that was not a concept that younger me or any of my peers or siblings could really capture. Maybe my older sister, she could have had a little bit of a dream or an idea from her friends at school and her experience of being in boarding school, but I had no idea.
Wow. And so before you came to the US, what were sports to you? Like, were there sports that you played that you were, excelled at? Were there ones that, had any sort of specific meaning to you?
I quickly realized, in those first few years of Lincoln that I completely had a different childhood. The survival dynamics and kind of like values that were instilled in terms of how I saw the world were completely, completely different. And that included sports. We did have some people that played sports. My name is Brolin because my mother was, a huge, like many Africans, a huge soccer fanatic, we call football. And her favorite player was Thomas Brolin from Sweden. So, she named me Brolin after that. And she moved and got to gain an opportunity or the visa she was able to gain through sports. And so she was an avid sports lady. She ran track. She, participated in whatever was available there, given that it's a religious country. Sports were around, I guess, my parents as they were uniting or unifying, but in the community, once we arrived in the community, sport was never the immediate thing. It was like more like doing chores, once you got that opportunity to go to school, it was like, hey, focus on school. This is not cheap. This is not available for everybody. And then just playing around, your occasional run around, play tag. Maybe you're playing soccer with a ball that you put together through trash bags, but nothing organized like we were able to find here in Lincoln.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious how you would describe Lincoln, but the shift in just environment must have been drastic from, the weather going from, I would imagine Uganda, a place that's maybe a little bit warmer to Massachusetts, pretty cold winters and whatnot. But also, Lincoln's suburb of Boston, it's, Revolutionary War, you're in the woods, the majority of the people are white. And so all of a sudden you're in this totally new environment. I remember you showing up and wondering, who is this kid? What was it like for you to arrive?
Yeah, I mean, definitely such a shocker because on one end you're experiencing utopia. Lincoln kind of almost gives me that vibe of straight off postcard. If you're thinking of Massachusetts postcards, it's the best description of the town. But also on the other end, a lot of unknown. So coming into a town where, like you mentioned, very few families of African descent or African Americans. A lot of our African American peers, as I said, to come to learn throughout like the school experience were getting bussed into the middle school. And also the language barrier. I came in, I think my first year within America was the first year I was exposed to English fully and also learning how to read, write, communicate. But at the same time, you're trying to reconnect and kind of galvanize this lingering connection that you have with a person that kind of looks like you, but you don't really understand who this person is. So it was a utopia mixed with a bunch of confusion, I would say, especially coming from
Yeah.
where I was coming from.
Yeah. Yeah. Will be very upfront and honest. And I definitely, you know, lacked kind of like an understanding of your background and was not as probably welcoming as I could have been. I mean, I think on top of that, Lincoln is our class was maybe the biggest ever in like school history, and it was 90 kids who the majority had gone to preschool together and middle school and so on. And so, it's tight knit where if there's a new person who comes in, they really stick out.
Yeah, I definitely felt that the isolation at the beginning because, like many towns in America, a lot of people gain that like acceptance and group mentality at a young age through the experiences, like you mentioned, going to school together, playing sports together, and being on different youth teams together. And then the experience of having your parents be able to connect, whether it's teacher conferences, teacher parent conferences, games, whatever function that would happen, which was the beauty of Lincoln. Coming into America, my mother wanted to move out of, she originally was living within Jamaica Plains and then Waltham, which are other cities within Massachusetts. But Lincoln was more of a family, more of a safer, and more of a controlled environment where a kid obviously did not have as much of the leeway of kind of navigating the society by themselves without the attachment of the parent. But the kids also needed the smaller, tight-knit communities, which I struggled with. Like you mentioned, I really, really, truly struggled coming in and finding a footing and where do I belong? Who do I talk with? And so those very first 3, 4 years were not just a blur within my own connection of me as a person, but like a struggle of like, what is American life like? Where do I belong? Who are my friends? It's very interesting you bring that up.
I remember you come into the Malika's house and I guess Chris is like, my best friend. We have known each other since we were a year and a half old, hung out together every day basically until the end of high school and still hang out often. We were in Montana together last week. But yeah, I remember you showing up to Chris's house somewhat unannounced. And I remember being like, who is this kid? Why is this kid here? Sort of thing. Like from my perspective, it was like, oh, you would call first sort of thing. And I'm sure from your perspective, you were looking for something to do and people to hang out with. And looking back on that, yeah, it's definitely something that I'm like, I could have done so much better in those situations.
Yeah, I feel like we all like have those moments where we look back and we're like, damn, that was a strange situation, or we could have handled it different. And yeah, I did not know the decor. I think a lot of my experience that I've seen through whether it's world travel, cultural travel, is like there's a certain decor that describes the values and the characteristics of those people within the community. And Chris Maleko is really, when I close my eyes and I really think of people that played such a pivotal role, the Malikas, the mother and father and Chris and his brother, but like really Chris and his mother and father, just the welcomingness that they allowed with me not understanding the decor of how things work played a pivotal role in me being comfortable because as you mentioned that they were the first people to celebrate my birthday. I never had a birthday celebration, and I remember his mother asking me, well, you don't know when your birthday is, or you don't have you don't know how to celebrate your birthday." And from the gesture of, hey, we're gonna show you how American life works to, momentarily, or is me showing up unannounced and kind of getting the welcome mat of like, hey, come on in, the boys are playing video games, oh, what's a video game? Like, what's the experience of how American kids hang out? And you guys played a huge pivotal role in that because, like you mentioned, it was with limited communication back then, limited research, somebody just randomly showing up and you're just like, yo, like, how do we hang out? We already have our inside jokes, but what a trip.
Yeah. Yeah. The Malikas are incredible. Shout out the Malikas. I had a similar experience. I spent so much time over there. So welcoming. Taught me so much about food and different cultures. And yeah, what a family. So you get to Lincoln, you're having this settling in period. The way I remember it is you kind of like found the skaters and got into skateboarding. Was that something that was just a natural fit? Was that something that you were interested in and sought out?
Man, I think it was both the I want to belong somewhere, and I've always been curious about something that like maybe a couple of times you had seen on screen or on TV, and just the personals that were around that at that time. Uh, first five people I'd met, and one of those first five people was after I met a kid named Daniele Soiker. I met Phil Hessler, and Phil Hessler and his whole ethos, or his whole family, were into both traditional sports and action sports. And then shortly after, I believe it was around sixth grade, we had another kid move into town named James McMahon, and between James McMahon and the, kind of the duo and the energy his family had, and then kind of the poise and stability Phil Hessler's family had. Those were the families, including the Malikas, that would always, extend a phone call. Hey, we're about to go to the movies. Hey, we're about to go do this. And once that became such a regular kind of like occurrence where I can feel a little bit of safety, skateboarding became the intermix of these guys skate. I guess I should, come on board, learn how to do it. But it was really the community aspect that then drove me and drew me towards skateboarding.
Yeah, the community I could totally see. I mean, you all, it seemed like hung out all the time. As soon as school was over, you were just finding a spot to go skate sort of thing. And it wasn't just in Lincoln. It seemed like you all would travel around and go to other towns too, which was pretty unique from our, I guess, grade or just, town culture. It was pretty insular.
Yeah, I thought that was always the coolest part of it because a lot of our town did intermingle with just the town itself. And at a young age, where you're not really finding belonging within your own town, um, I never asked him a question if Phil felt like an outsider, but I for sure knew James, having been a late addition to the town, felt the outside perspective. And he was really the pushing group member that was like, ours, hey, let's go to this town. Let's check out Brighton. Let's check out Waltham. Let's experience this. Because he had all the brothers who were experiencing a lot of what he was trying to bring his friends along to. We were mysteriously ending up in different towns, really getting in trouble doing some dumb stuff, enjoying youth and enjoying being teenagers through a different perspective. And I'm completely, completely grateful that that happened because he allowed us to see other, age.
And then eventually, I know you ended up in Wyoming. I think you also went to private school at some point too, before you ended up leaving. I know the Hesslers are so into action sports and whatnot, and it felt like the move to Wyoming was really because they wanted to snowboard more. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's about right. Fast forward after I settle into, at least I'm feeling like I'm settling into my Lincoln beginnings. I have family issues, which is now that I'm a bit older and I can understand the attributing factors to that, it was completely, completely uh, unavoidable, I would say. So my mom and I what I would think would have been a natural bond because of leaving at such a young age and not really creating and fostering that parent kid bond that unifies and kind of is unbreakable. We ran into some challenges to where I actually moved down the street from you. I was living in Lincoln housing, which is, kind of the condominiums, the only condominiums for a long time within the town, to moving in with Susan Meiger, who was, my mom's ex-employer, who had been so embedded within the family that she ended up stepping up to be a mother or a surrogate mother for me until now, actually, which is it's a different story, different connection. But between that and having a lot of troubles, me having a new home, and Susan at the moment when I moved in with her family and joining, and Sam, her husband, gets sick, I end up almost going back to a similar situation that had been following me over and over again, which is lack of family, lack of stability. And through those two situations, she actually had gone around to various families that she was close to and was able to gain both audience with them, trust, and be able to share my story to where those families came together, including the Hesslers, and they were able to send me to private school so I can at least learn what I can learn, which I learned a lot. Not only did I learn how to navigate American society, but I learned how to study. I learned the importance of education and how to navigate that side of things. And through the contributions and, you know, the performances that I was gaining in education, going from like being in the middle of the pack to headmaster's list, honors, higher classes. I felt like whenever I would come back to Lincoln, I felt more connected to my peers who I always envied. I remember one time when I was young, I went over to Henry Foster's house, and I think it was a time when he was reading some type of book and during that Harry Potter days. And I always was so envious of him and his sisters, of how cognitively they were so not poised, but like well raised, from his reading to how he approached school to how he approached friendships. I was always in awe of the kids of Lincoln. And I think private school and the turmoils that I was going through at home allowed for that marriage of me being able to see the American perspective or the American childhood at a greater stage than I would have been able to see.
Yeah. The like prep school, private school versus public school dynamic in Massachusetts is so interesting. It's not something, or maybe just New England, it's not something that have seen. I live in California now. There, other places I've lived are like Ohio. But yeah, it was always interesting seeing kids go to a prep school from a public school and then come back and they felt more confident and more maybe fulfilled, or I'm not sure what, but they definitely do a good job of prepping you.
Yeah, it's cliche and ironic because I went to an all boys school, and the discipline instilled of just like having dress code. We had three, four different colors we could wear, shirt and tie every day. You had morning breakfast, lunch, dinner. You had kitchen crews. You had chores. It unveiled a level of Americanness that you're right, you're so right. It's so like Northeast American. And every once in a while you travel and you see it in other pockets of America, but it's so unique to that like, upper side of the country that it's crazy. But very, very thankful for it.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there was a tough period at home and tough period of adjustment, but what came out of it was really positive. And it sounds like maybe that experience of coming back to Lincoln after going to the school, maybe a feeling of like accomplishment and, moving in a direction that you were excited about.
Absolutely, yeah. And definitely you start to feel like, okay, maybe I've earned the right to be able to hang out with my peers. There were moments of like, I think Lord of the Rings was the movie series that the Malikas really liked, and there was a time I got like phone call to go to the movies, and I felt like I wasn't a burden. I was not just kind of like tagging along. I felt like, okay, I'm slowly earning the right to be able to hang out and, understand what these guys understand as well.
Wow. So during that period, you left Lincoln. Were you still skating? Were you snowboarding at all?
I ended up having to go to, so you know, I left Lincoln Public School. I believe seventh grade becomes my last year before I have to go on to prep school for eighth and ninth grade, which majority of my friends were going to the big school LS. And at the time, I didn't have a home. I couldn't go back to my mother's. I couldn't go back to Susan's. So I leave to go to boarding school in Vermont. I end up going to Vermont Academy after applying to a series of different schools around the region. And that's the first time that I'm not only exposed to Vermont, but I'm exposed to a whole different demographic of people. So I'm not skating as much, and I'm not as in tune with, my friends in Lincoln. But I'm also slowly gaining understanding and closer gravitation towards winter sports, which were the main sports for the friend favorite sport, and Phil Hessler becomes one of the main friends that I hang out my majority of my later middle school, high school, beginning of high school years. And he had a huge fascination for snowboarding. I had a huge curiosity for that, and I think Vermont Academy brings that picture together.
So you go up to Vermont, not able to skate as much, but you really start getting into more of the winter sports as you're becoming better friends with Bill Hessler, and that's starting to take off. So then how did you end up? I know the Hesslers went to Wyoming, to Jackson Hole for like a winter one year, and they didn't move there full time. And then the following year, if I remember correct, they moved there full time and you went with them. How did you end up moving there with them?
Man, I always answer, or at least ask myself the same question before I try to answer it, because there's so many pivotal change-ups and, rights or lefts that I've taken in my life, where if I could have taken a left, my life turns out different. But this time I take a right, and that right becomes a couple of summers prior to the Hesslers moving. I really hit it off and created a huge connection with Chris Hessler. So I ended up starting to, as a youth, he had a huge role in just not only developing his boys, but developing the boys his boys hung out with. And I happened to be one of the guys that would be at the house all the time. And one of his goals and rules was a kid had to work each summer. So I ended up getting hired by Chris Hessler that summer to help mow the lawn and paint a fence. And through that connection and back and forth of being at the house all the time, hanging out with his boys and kind of hanging out with his family, and the exposure to that family as a whole, I think grew a liking and a comfort to me, where Chris himself mentioned this and said, "Hey, I did not see that you had a role model of a father that could really steer you and navigate your growth in America. And I thought that I could do an equal or good enough of a job to somebody that would have played that role or your father." So him and his wife sit down with my mother and Susan, and Chris proposed that same conversation of like, I think this guy is a great kid. He has potential to go one way where he can turn out to be something good, or he has potential to kind of become average to also another potential to not turn out to be something good and get into trouble. But I would like to step up and try to be a father figure. But in order to do that, I and my wife are moving our kids to Wyoming to pursue snowboarding. So the family had decided they wanted to pursue snowboarding at the highest level. And Chris had started to see the trajectory of some of our friends, which, James was not the best influence, but the influence, like we mentioned earlier, of being able to go to different towns, meet different kids, we had slowly started to discover, the classic old teenager, let's find trouble kind of mentality. I think James had started smoking weed. We had not, because I was in private school and Phil was closely monitored by his parents, and James came from a single parent household. Chris just thought that it would be best for the kids to not be closer to such influences and to go in such isolated, remote country like Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And here I was, moving again. So that's how I ended up in Wyoming.
So cool. For just context, Chris Hessler is Phil Hessler's dad.
Correct.
And so I mean, that's incredible. So before we started chatting and recording, I was just kind of explaining what I'm up to. And so I'm started to take classes in psychology and I'm 3 weeks in. But one of the really interesting things that I've learned so far is, as far as mental health goes, there's a lot of different factors that end up being an influence on your mental health. There's biological ones. You might have a predisposition to some sort of mental disorder, but there's also all these social and socioeconomic ones. And it's an equation that is kind of ever evolving. I've found really cool is, family and that, teachers and caretakers and those sorts of things really matter early in life. And if you don't have that, it can have negative implications. And if you do end up, or I guess if you don't have it and you do end up getting it, it can always change for the positive. It's a, equation where if you have, a badder, worse, hand of cards early in life, if things change, it can all kind of swing back in a really positive way. And that's incredible that somebody like a Chris Hessler takes an interest in you and shows you something like summer work or something like that. And you build a relationship based off that that's taken you in part to where you're at today.
Yeah, I mean, I not only do I try to cherish and show the gratitude of what you mentioned, these two pivotal relationships from the Hesslers to Susan, but without Susan really taking that plunge of like, hey, this lady is a great lady. She's just facing challenges that she can't control. Her kids might be a circumstance of that unless we intervene and community can surround them. My life will kind of stay stagnant and you come to America like every other immigrant, but you really take, who knows, never know what God has in store, but you take a longer path of development than you would have. And then I think the confidence that Susan was able to give the Hesslers of, hey, he has already lived with one family and he could be comfortable and will be comfortable living with our family, it kind of starts that second leg of now having met another pivotal relationship that takes me out to another part of the world where I had to rely heavily on that relationship because at the time that we moved to Wyoming, I believe I'm about 15 and a half, about to turn 16. I'm already enrolled in boarding school in Vermont, kind of having that process figured out. Uh, I just kind of gotten a hand of what American life is on my identity and individuality was starting to develop. And for somebody to step in and be like, "Hey, I can guide you to a further, to another level than what you had expected," was definitely unheard of. And I'm not sure if, I don't know, we live in crazy times now, but I'm not sure if that type of extended community happens as much these days as it used to.
Yeah, well said. Susan's incredible too. And I imagine having somebody like her and somebody like Chris in your corner is huge. Um,
Huge.
it sounded like things were going really well in Vermont. And then, the Hesslers and you are building this relationship and you ultimately decide to go to Wyoming. Was that a big decision? Was there any doubt in that?
Well, I think part of what made Vermont go well, which goes back to the original crisis meeting that Susan was able to call, was the Hesslers were part of the five families that were supporting which I find out way later, but they were part of the five families that were supporting my education in Vermont. And the biggest part in why they were able to approach my mother, the proposal to move to Wyoming, was that boarding school was great for moments when I was busy and I had structure. But there was also those moments with, hey, what are you going to do when you come home? Oh, if Sam, who was Susan's husband, was having a flare up, unfortunately, at the moment, he had lower lobe lung cancer, and the cancer was starting to metastasize and spread to other areas, from being a teenager and having jobs and needing to be kind of busy. That was a huge stressor on the my guts. And so coming home, the family I started to slowly gravitate towards, or the only home I had was going home with Phil, or sleeping on his couch, or bouncing from the Hesslers to the McMahon's couch. I kind of had a moment of time where I was couch surfing, to where when the question came, "Hey, do you want to come to Wyoming with us?" It was an obvious yes, because it was like, well, once school's done and I'm at home, I've yet to create the verbiage or the conversation with my mother where I can drop in and out and be safe or feel safe or even cared for. Susan is kind of having a tough time right now. Her husband is dying and the family's facing some hardships. And now you guys are leaving, so where does that leave me? So it was a no-brainer of like, yeah, I have nothing to lose. You might as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then, if moving from Uganda to Lincoln was a big shift, moving from Lincoln to Jacksonville, Wyoming, probably just as big of a shift.
Man, that was, I think what made that a beautiful shift is I was not going through that by myself. The Hesslers they had three boys in total with a younger child, a sister named Nikki, but she was way too young to really experience the shock of moving to a small town. But Phil, myself, and the two younger brothers, Jack and Jimmy, truly were faced with that reality of like, wow, we went from living in Boston, yeah, we're living on the outskirts of Boston slash Vermont kind of atmosphere, to you're living in the boonies. Like you're not seeing anybody for miles. You're not seeing a huge population. You're seeing more cows than you're seeing individuals. And at the time when we moved, you don't have that hype of what Jackson Hole is today at the moment that we're moving. The town is kind of slowly opening up, but you don't have the Instagram hyper, kind of reality celebrity focus and overly expensive town. You just have this sleeper old country town in the middle of Wyoming that is just known to have crazy amount of snow. And we show up in the fall, yeah, talk about everybody already united, just like in Lincoln, where people had already gone to school together at a young age, already community formed and impenetrable and limited activities. You can't take a train or, go to the next town over like we're used to. So we really were stuck and ended up bonding way more than we would have if we had moved to a town that was a bit more similar to Lincoln.
Yeah. Yeah, I would imagine. For snowboarding in New England, it's something that people do, but it's not something that's you could do in Lincoln, right? You always are driving somewhere. Moving to some place like Jackson Hole, that it seems like winter sports are these sports. It's less of, soccer, football, and those sorts of things, more of snowboarding, skiing, things that you can do on a mountain when it's cold. Is that true?
Absolutely. I mean, I never had an experience where a town evolves around the nature of its surroundings and where students, faculty, and kind of members of society highly support and participate in outdoor activities. I remember I showed up and that fall I played football. You know, you get your classic Friday night lights, the whole town shows up, including the mayor, everything shuts down, they support the local high school. But that was really a precipice of preparation for winter and what the town and everybody avidly did, which was, hey, we're first and foremost, these are long Wyoming winters. You gotta pick up something to do in the winter or you're not gonna survive. We get lots of snow, and everybody and their mother participates in some form of fast, whether it's we're snowboarding, we're ice climbing, we're snowmobiling, we're doing something involving, the environment around us. And that, if that was not the case, I don't think my snowboarding, which ends up being the sport of choice and the career of choice that I end up picking later on, would not have been at the same level.
Yeah. Yeah. And what a level, I guess it was. So we started the conversation with you talking about Burton and how proud you were of that moment of being sponsored by Burton. 15-year-old Brolin is moving to Jackson Hole. Like what was snowboarding to you at 15 years old? What was your vision for what you could do with snowboarding at that age?
I think definitely 15-year-old Brolin was not thinking Burton level snowboarder, Red Bull and all these different, various sponsors I was able to pick up over a decade of, the professional side of things. I was just there trying to, at first I was deceived. I'd gotten exposed to skiing through the MyGats, going to Vermont and having gone to school in Vermont Academy, you kind of get the Vermont exposure of the winter experience, people kind of gravitating towards. But it was not until you get to Jackson, Wyoming, where you realize the snow's trying to kill you, and this is not ice anymore. This is not, the East Coast anymore. This is champagne powder that is deep and deep. You're falling into a crevasse. You're going to sink. So those first two winters were really difficult for me because the Hesslers, as you mentioned, were already transferring their kids back and forth and being introduced not only to snowboarding but being introduced to uh, competitive side of snowboarding and trying to shoot towards having their kids be on the U.S. team to compete in various disciplines within winter sports. So for me, I was just kind of a tag along, not only am I a tag along on the family, like, hey, you guys did me a favor, but now I feel like I'm a tag along with activities because I have no idea what I'm doing. And I feel like every single turn or every single moment, I'm about to kill myself or die or wrap myself around a tree. I talk about a steep learning curve. I
Yeah.
mean, we had Travis Rice as our guest professional, I mean, as our guest coach. And for me, you just hear, oh, Travis Rice. And everybody says, oh, Travis is coming. You get this excitement. I'm like, I have no idea who this guy named Travis Rice is. And ends up being the best, Hall of Famer world snowboarder within our generation, both outside competition and within competition. And he was a weekend everyday coach for the team, so that tells you the level of snowboarding that the kids that the Hesslers had kind of fallen into. Because even they were the outsiders, but they had training. The kids of the town already had a high level of training, just like the kids of Lincoln, they had started as babies. And here's me, who kind of came from Uganda, a whole poor country, to Massachusetts, to now I'm in Wyoming, just looking around, being like, man, I'm cold 24/7, feel like I'm about to die and I have to relearn the whole idea of like how do you survive in winter, all the way to how do you dress, because that was different from Massachusetts.
Yeah. Yeah. Were you guys snowboarding? It seemed like from when I would catch up with you and Phil, it was almost like maybe you were going to a school that was uh that prioritize snow sports. So you'd, do your education, but you'd also, be able to get out and go and snowboard and practice and team aspects. Am I right about that? Or was that once you got to college?
No, I mean, the funny part, you're absolutely right about that, but the funny aspect of that is the school itself was the public school. So the public school
Really?
already was so geared around supporting kids snowboarding. And it did happen to be winter in the West, which meant that the way the sun kind of rose and kind of was able to leave, especially during winter times, was shorter and shorter amount of days. And the school wanted to support the kids that were going to school. But just because of a school program, a lot of kids from Jackson ended up becoming, I mean, they're some of the most premier pros within the industry, whether it's skiing, uh, mountaineering or snowboarding, because the school was that supportive. So I
Wow.
believe for 4 days a week, we'd go to school, and by 1 o'clock, we're done with school, and we had practice, which was a part of the school recognizing, like somebody would go to basketball, would go to snowboarding practice. We had a coach show up, we had an agenda, we had goals to meet. I mean, it transformed not just my snowboarding, but like the vision of how you look at the mountain had transformed fully.
Wow. So once you get to that point, that sounds like, very serious competitive snowboarding. That's kind of like a shift from snowboarding for fun, but even like typical high school sports, if you will. All of a sudden you're working with somebody like a Travis Rice, who's, you know, maybe the best in the world at what they're doing. What was that shift like mentally? What was the demand like? What was the process that you had to learn and start to implement to be successful in that environment?
I think for me at the moment, the focus was so solely on how do you belong in a family. I was very, very aware at that age. I'm now kind of creeping into my later teens. I was very aware of my family situation. I was very made aware, especially having moved to Wyoming. I was one of two black people in the whole town. So I
Hmm.
was definitely made aware of what my identity was and kind of my belonging within winter sports to where I had not pictured or put snowboarding at such a huge high mantle. Now, don't get me wrong, I was competitive, and what made the competition even greater, or my trajectory to learning snowboarding faster, was the family conversations and the dinners, the classic teenage back and forth teasing of like, hey, I can do this and you can't do this type of atmosphere forced me to really impel myself deeper and deeper into snowboarding. But in the back of my mind, I was like, hey, I'm going to go to college. I'm going to go study and try to be a doctor. I heard from my mother, from everybody, you come to America, you study, you become a doctor, life becomes better. Boy, was I wrong, but yeah, you don't know what you don't know.
So at that age, you were more focused on the education side of things. Surf
Yeah,
or snowboarding was just kind of like an adjacent activity.
yeah. I mean, you got to remember, I had started to drink the Kool-Aid of American prep schools, more specifically New England prep schools, coming from eighth grade to ninth grade, you prep for what is called secondary school standardized test, which is the version of the SAT that prep schools have. So you get a nice dopamine hit from that of like, oh wow, I'm not as dumb as I thought. I can comprehend things. I can read. You get into a school like Vermont Academy, and the whole time you just came off trials of having to compete to get into this school. So I have that whole mentality kind of consuming me of like, oh wow, I'm in Vermont Academy, I gotta maintain grades, I'm taking AP classes, I'm being exposed, which is the beauty of New England prep schools. It's a completely different education process with smaller classes, more intense, more driven to try to prepare kids for college. And my dream was Susan's kids are really well educated. Everybody in Massachusetts is really educated. How cool would it be to get a full ride scholarship to a school and get a college education? So even my idea to move into Wyoming and the way it was able to be sold to me was you move to Wyoming, your application to some of the schools like UMass and some of the colleges you're thinking of is amplified because you're coming from a smaller town and they only give fewer seats to people within big cities. I'm not sure if you remember those stories once it came to applying to college and the process
Definitely.
of how to apply to college. But that was my whole belonging of like, oh, I'm in Wyoming. Oh, well, an applicant from Wyoming is going to stand out better applying to Duke and has a potential to getting, a full ride scholarship than if I apply coming from Massachusetts with such a high competitive rate. And that was my goal, and that's kind of actually what I ended up doing. Is that Duke gave me a position, and then they gave me $14,000 to go to go to school. They're like, "Yeah, we'll give you 14. We'll make it $28,000." I was like, I was so excited, and then I run to Sandy, and I'm like, "Wow, I got into my dream school. They gave me $28,000," and she's like, I don't think you could afford that." It was the focus was still, go to school. If you're not a hustler, you're not going to snowboard.
So you got into Duke and you got a scholarship offer?
I did. I just didn't get enough money
Yeah.
to,
Wow.
because remember, I didn't have parents. Oh, I did have
Yeah.
parents, but Susan had prepped for her kids, and her kids were out of college. The Hesslers had prepped for their kids. It's not like one day you wake up and you're like, oh, I have college money for my kids.
Yep.
They had more kids coming down the pipeline. Phil was the first kid. Then they had two more boys coming with Nikki coming along. And their conversation was like, we would love to support you. We're going to be a great family. But once it came to an education, the college, I just had this crippling understanding that once I was 18, I was on my own. So I had to go to a school that could at least help pay for a lot of that burden.
Got it. So a theme of this podcast is kind of transition, specifically with athletes. And once you're done with your sport, how did you transition into what you're doing now? And what you're doing now, you're in medical school. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing and what you're studying?
Yeah. So currently, what my trajectory is I'd like to be a neurologist, but most specifically along the way and along from my injuries that I was able to sustain from my sport of choice, I've decided to become an upper cervical, a neurological doctor. So I deal with nervous systems, both from, kind of the structural side of things and the objective side of things, the psychology, the kind of mental health space, and the connectivity of the brain to the body. I'm like what you like to call a fancy electrician or a chiropractor. But these days, I got into medical school wanting to go to the surgical route, wanting to be an orthopedic surgeon and, kind of work in hospitals and, really with a dream to work at Mass General. When I was 16, Chris had gotten sick, and Chris at the time is my foster father. And through his sickness, I was exposed to the Mass General pipeline and training. So I was a Bull French intern for 6, 7 summers down there. I had a doctor that I was answering to who was a huge inspirational figure. Shout out Dr. Huckberg, in kind of mapping out what my educational path would look like and what I should be interested in or not. Because he had done a lot of cancers, and with Chris having had brain cancer or lymphoma cancer, I ended up having a lot of interest about the neck, about kind of the brain and how the brain, the neck, the body connect. And then with a lot of my friends and peers having a lot of concussions, having a few, unfortunately, knock on wood, get paralyzed. Oh my God. I slowly regained my interest and went towards the nervous system route, the spinal cord route, and just understanding how that can influence the overall health of the body. So I'm finishing that up.
Neurons, dendrites, axon terminals.
Yep, the whole thing,
Cool.
man.
So it sounds like your mom told you that that was the thing to do, to be a doctor. Was that something that, from the time you came to the US, that was the goal?
I think from the time I come into the US, that's kind of the vocalized, what we like to say, subconscious implant, subconsciously every once in a while. She was a hospice nurse, had worked, she had wished she had become a doctor from the knowledge that she had gained over the years, but due to lack of funding and education, that did not pan out. And I think she started at a young age with both of my sisters. I mean, one of my sisters ends up being a nurse practitioner, and then the other one go to medical school. So she had started at such a young age trying to instill the idea that medicine was the freedom to not only the American dream, but to gaining both respect and acceptance within communities, such as the community like Lincoln. So I think she, having had lower education and accent and kind of her position and her job, I think she really did not wish that for her kids. you know, in her view, saw that medicine was a way to climb that American trajectory and be able to both gain respect, honor, and be able to serve community. And I, I,
Nice.
I kind of stuck to it, you know.
Seriously. With a little bit of a, you went the scenic route to get there.
Yeah, man, I'm a fifth year, 6 year senior, but uh, I had to make it. I had to mold it both in what my societal dream was, and become individualized to that same dream. I had to make it my own. You know, I had to see what does that mean. I know a lot of what I like to say, a lot of African parents dream with their eyes closed. But the difference from African parents, and this is the beauty having had both the African side and really the white side. I like to call myself like an Oreo because I grew up with both cultures and I understand them so deeply. One side supports your dreams through the steps, the other side gives you huge dreams, no support, and kind of pushes you off off the ledge of like, you should just do this. Uh, so I had to make it my own because I used to fight internally with that of you want me to be, it's, similar to transitioning from sports. You individually want to be great at something, but you have to own that greatness so that it's not determined by the people hiring you. And then once you transition from that, and I experienced this actually a year and a half ago, living snowboarding and starting to call myself a doctor and starting to identify as a medical student, the feeling of like, wow, something I don't feel right. This is not me. I still have an accent. Maybe I'm not smart enough. Wow, all my
Mm.
peers are a bit younger. Wow, they're sharp. They come from these schools. They come from these families. And you almost have an identity crisis. So I never wanted to go to such a lengthy process and have the process be owned by an idea that I did it for my mother, or I did it because
Yeah.
somebody told me. So I took my sweet time with it.
How do you end up working through those sorts of thoughts? Kind of like imposter syndrome.
Man, I feel like, the imposter syndrome starts at such a young age because, my own best friend Phil, who wanted to become such a pro snowboarder, kind of realizes like, hey, maybe telling stories and starting with the closest story that I have next to me, which was my story, is the path that I'm called for. And then the next person that we're envisioning within the family to becoming a professional was Jack. And Jack, kind of goes through uh, a change of what I like to say, kind of life changes that allow him to maybe not gravitate towards snowboarding as much and think about his identity and what he wants to do within the sport. And here I am kind of snowboarding, slowly getting better and better, getting invited to different competitions. I won a few competitions, which I don't know if it was luck or if I had figured things out. And I'm climbing the ladder and I'm not sure if I was the one that was supposed to be there because I always viewed my snowboarding through the lenses of my brothers, which are the Hesslers. And through their lenses, I viewed myself a bit lesser because I started from a bit less of a starting point. So I always just had this invisible, deep down, both fear and, uh, identity crisis that was kind of plaguing me. On one end, I'm like, wow, like I'm snowboarding, and people don't know how good I am. But in the other end, I never wanted people to know how good I was. Hence, I would cover myself up. I mean, you and I could be on the same mountain, and you would not know that I'm standing next to you unless I made it known. And it was not until towards my later years of my career that I would make it known, like, hey, what's up? Hey, I'm Brolin. But in the middle of that career, like I could stand next to you, fully covered up, goggles on, helmet on, snowboard like you, snowboard like one of your favorite pros, and you would not know that was me. And I think ideally that was me just facing those mental battles that come with, being like any other athlete, being in a sport, having to perform and having to climb the ladder through that sport, whether it's within your peers or within sponsorships.
Yeah. Yeah. I would imagine that was probably a lot to have to process as like a 22 to, in your 20s, I guess. Um, and we kind of left off on you're applying to colleges, you get into Duke. You ultimately end up going to Westminster College, right?
Yeah, I did.
Why did you end up picking Westminster?
Snowboarding started to become a more and more influence in my life. And going back to the conversation of how was I going to support myself, Westminster College, which ends up being the biggest, another turn point in my life and a huge blessing. They end up giving me a full ride scholarship, tuition and room and board included, to come to Westminster, and on an education merit level, which was not what my other schools were offering. Obviously, I wanted to go back somewhere, either go to South Carolina or go, back to the East Coast. But here comes a school offering a full ride. And that same school happened to have such a huge growing population of Olympians and putting their name into the idea of like, we're trying to foster the snowboarding side of things, snowboarding and skiing side of things. So that sells Phil on the idea of trying to go to Westminster because in Phil's eyes, he wants to be a professional snowboarder and he wants to snowboard. He wants to go to a school that where he can snowboard all the time. And I wanted to go to a school that Phil wanted to go to because I had found the solace and brotherhood and friendship through, through the community that we had created together. You got to remember right before college, a year and a half before that, Phil and the Hessler as a family are facing this decision and this conversation of Chris Hessler having to pass away due to his cancer diagnosis. And thank God he's in remission now. But the kids, I think the kids really did not know how to internalize the diagnosis and dove deeper into snowboarding and kind of escaping away from that traditional go to college, find a job in corporate America, and just kind of make a family. So they dove closer to the idea of adventure. With the way we did it, it was like, all right, Phil doesn't want to go to Duke. Well, I did not want to be a legacy of Dartmouth, and I did not apply, nor did I think I could get in. But he had because his dad was a Dartmouth alum, but he did not want to go to the East Coast. So we decided, did we want to either go to Boulder or did we want to go to Utah? But Boulder was too expensive for me, and I could not afford it. And it just happened to be that Utah and Westminster were the school that we both could afford. It was 20 minutes from the mountains, and rightfully so, we had moved to Utah just without knowing it as the industry and as snowboarding is picking up. So we just 2 times in a row hit it right on the money from moving to Jackson Hole at the right time, learning how to snowboard Big Mountain, to moving to Utah at the right time, embedding ourselves in the community there. And I'm getting the education I'm kind of chasing and desire, and he's getting the exposure and the snowboarding that he wanted to get.
What year did you move to Jackson Hole? Was it like '08?
Yeah. Oh, oh 08, oh 09 was the year we moved there.
Got you. And so then you're moving to Utah in like 2011?
2011. Yep, August
Got you.
2011. We start we start school. We're roommates freshman year. I believe it was August, right before Labor Day. Labor Day is September, so we move like August 11th to move in for orientation.
Wow.
Yeah.
So true brothers living together in college, roommates. And Westminster is like a very unique school in their format of education and sports, right?
Yeah, it's I mean, what a blessing and kind of a small discovery of a school that was competitive. We like to say it's like kind of the Colgate of the West Coast, or they like to say that, but it's a small liberal school that has a small enough class size, highly reputable degrees and kind of curriculum, but still really, really like fostered the outdoor side of things, just like the Wyoming schools did. I mean, I had a professor, my organic chemistry professor, because I wanted to go to medical school. That was still the goal. He held classes for some of us that were avid snowboarders and skiers at night because he would wake up and go ski and snowboard. So that's how in tune the school was with supporting that.
So cool. Some things are just kind of meant to be. It seems like that just popped up at the right time. You get a scholarship. It's where Phil wants to go. I'm sure that that's just like a continuation of being able to just sit in that culture and embody what it is to live by a mountain.
All right. We would never have known because I remember visiting and being like, wow, this feels like a bigger Wyoming, just more of a bigger town. And I told myself, obviously, Utah has its reputation of, being a Mormon state and kind of, being a bit of one of the lesser funner places to go to college and also grow up. So I told myself, oh, I'm gonna come do my time and then I'll move back to Massachusetts, figure out life from there. I blinked, I think. I don't leave Utah again until 10 years later. I don't start thinking about moving out of Utah until 2023. I mean, uh, 2022, right after right after the pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we were just having our conversation, it sounds like 16-year-old Brolin knew he wanted to be a doctor, wanted to work in neurology in some sense, whether it's a surgeon or something else. And you've gone on this huge tangent with your life, like massive journey. And from afar, it seems like a big part of that has been the Far From Home movie that you alluded to. Phil is interested in filmmaking and storytelling. You obviously have an incredible story, and it seems like a match made in heaven. Did you have any idea that making Far From Home would lead you on the path you've been on now?
I had absolutely no idea, man. I thought that we were, my original idea for Far From Home was like, man, I'm gonna get into a good medical school, like, everybody says write a good essay, compelling. Obviously, you needed the, good MCAT score and you needed to stand out through your volunteering and all that. But I had no way to convey the ups and downs and the pivotal moments of my life that I thought would make me a great candidate for medical schools in writing because A, I sucked at writing. We now live in the era of ChatGPT and kind of easy writing where you can, write massive stories. But back then, I had to sit down and kind of convey that story myself. So I did not think anything was going to come out of it. I think a lot of us who worked on Far From Home and created the project did not think beyond just a friendship and kind of, we're all doing something cool and get to travel to a few countries, that it would open so many doors for a lot of us, including myself.
Yeah. So for people who might not know what Far From Home is, do you mind just describing the movie?
Yeah, Far From Home becomes almost an persona of what my life leading up to college was. It's done through a narrative, through first person interviews, rather than me telling you my story. Phil, a college friend of mine, and a couple of different friends got together and they found pivotal people within my life and interviewed them. And together through the interviews, they, kind of create a storyline that tells the story from their perspectives, and I add on through the kind of the experiences and some of the ups and downs that I had gone through. And that becomes the story of my life, kind of embodied in a small, short, 58-minute documentary that we submitted to, I believe it was at first Sundance, Tribeca, and then Santa Barbara Film Festival. And we ended up in 57 film festivals around the world, won awards. And the film festival scene, shout out to the film festivals and indie festival scene, because that really allowed us to be seen and allowed my story at a time where stories were kind of being yawned for to resonate to a lot of not just the audience but to producers and leaders in various groups. To I think at some point we were speaking in high schools. I kind of became like a motivational speaker at some point, where you're traveling to different places in the world. We flew to Sweden for 3 days just to speak to high schoolers and chill far from home. It was crazy, crazy moment. But it's a small document kind of showcasing my life.
So for anybody who's listening who hasn't seen it, I recommend it. And a lot of the people that are interviewed are people we've talked about. So people like Susan McGatt, I remember having a big part in it. Obviously the Hesslers, Phil, Jack, Chris, and yeah. And then of course James McMahon too. And it ultimately ended up getting bought by Red Bull.
It did, yeah. Red Bull took a huge interest in the story, and I mean, catalyzed, propelled us to a different level because the Red Bull and Red Bull Media owning the rights to the story, um, they were able to, kind of put it all over their different platforms and like exposing us to both a level of credibility and also audience that we'll never thought we'd be able to see.
Yeah. Yeah. So you really, this is kind of the start of this tangent that is a professional snowboarding career where, again, at 16, it sounds like you kind of have it figured out with what you ultimately wanted to do. And it seems like this movie was maybe a means to get there, at least at first. You wanted to be involved with it as a way to get into medical school, not necessarily to become a professional snowboarder.
Yeah, I mean, the start of how they wrote me into the whole story and then kind of the finished product is it's the funny thing of like, you never know where your journey is going to take you and just enjoying the destinations enjoying the journey itself rather than the destination. Far from home really played that role within my life because I had a destination in mind. I had an idea of what that destination would be. I honestly did not think that I would have to wait until I was 30 to, 28 to start my restart my educational career. I thought, oh, okay, I'll finish college. Maybe I'll, do this little story thing. I'll snowboard for a year, and then people will not be that interested. I'll never become a professional, and I'll go back to doing what I was doing. Yeah, that was a lie. And here we are now.
How does snowboarding work professionally? Were you doing competitions? I know within like surfing, which is surf a lot now, you have the competition route, but you also have this kind of free surfer route where it's less about organized competition, more about kind of doing your own thing and travel. And it seems like snowboarding has that as well through films and those sorts of things. I think of somebody like you mentioned Travis Rice as being like a quintessential kind of like free snowboarder, if you will.
I think similar to surfing, and what you have experienced, snowboarding has three pillars that kind of intertwine and feed into each other. There's a fourth one that's opening up with kind of where society's at right now with social media, vlogging, and YouTube. But it usually was the video pros built and with the embedding culture of where brands the outside culture or the sport culture kind of envisioned themselves. And then you had the contest kids who drove the culture deeper into kind of, other places. So, Slovenia, Russia, whatnot. And the competition, I think, propels people like skateboarding or surfing to be able to see what the sport is all about. The filming pros embody what they do on a day-to-day basis or what the culture of that sport is. And then the everyday consumer or the weekend warrior becomes the culture because that's the person kind of dreaming and kind of buying and participating and seeing themselves wishing that they were pro, but they're not putting in the same amount of time as the video or the contest kid. And for myself, I was on to gain respect in the sport, you have to start out competing. Very few people get that kind of tap on the shoulder that you're culturally relevant and you're culturally accepted by a lot of snowboarders, not just the professional ones, but the culture itself from the weekend warriors. Because I think the weekend warriors they make you pro or they make you a fan or somebody to have a fan base, but your own peer give you that badge of honor that you're a professional to that level. So I started out competing. My goal was to try to compete right after Sochi as my performance in competitions grew. My goal was to try to go to Korea in 2018. And so I slowly start training for that and joined the World Circuit, the FIS, which is the Federal International Ski Federation, which hosted all the global competitions. I believe 2 years after that, in 2015, and I started a federation in Uganda to be able to represent Uganda at the Winter Olympics. And in order to do that, you had to compete, qualify, and be able to prove that you are within top 115 of the world. And once I gained that ranking through competitions, and my own peers on the competition circuit, as well as the video pro and the everyday mountain pro, started to respect not only just my story of like, oh, this is some kid with a story of snowboarding, but no, this is a snowboarder who had a story. That's where you get the brands. I think in 2016 I signed with Visa, and then I signed with Adidas 2016 as well. And then the snowball just starts from there. You get the big brands to support you. Your performance has to hold up. And I believe I compete under those brands for 2 years and really, really put my head down because now I'm farther away from getting into medical school than I thought. I thought my life was over. So let me just dive into snowboarding. And the deeper I dove into it, the better I got, the better my sponsors got. It's not until 2017 that I get that, like what I consider the badge from my own peers of like, yeah, man, no, if we're going somewhere, you're getting a phone call. We're going to make sure we call you. Like if there's a trip, even if it's like, we're going to Japan next month, you're going to be on the list. And That for me was like really what I was chasing, my own peers to see that I was as not equally as good as them, but I can belong, I could tag. And I'm sure it's the same thing in surfing.
Um, I imagine there's a lot of the terms core, right? You want to be core. You don't want to be a poser or in surfing a kook, right? Um, for me, my focus is like, I just want to be competent. I want to be able to paddle out anywhere and not be a bother for anybody and just belong, which it sort of sounds like what you're describing a little bit.
Definitely. Yeah.
So you get sponsored by Visa in 2016. It sounds like you put, applying to medical school on hold, maybe. Like, how did you get from, maybe being a senior at Westminster, the Far From Home movie comes out, you're touring that to starting to do competitions? Like, was your goal always to make it to the Olympics? Was that really what you wanted to do? Was that something that the movie comes out, there's success with the movie, and then it snowballs and you kind of end up there?
I think the latter, I think the movie comes out because it's hard, I've had many conversations with different families about their kids trying to go to the Olympics and what it takes. But it's one of those things where timing, placement, and just kind of circumstance all have to align. It's almost like the perfect union or the perfect lineage has to happen. I just I was snowboarding with the goal of like, let me snowboard my friends. If I have friends, I have community. When I have community, I feel like I belong somewhere and I feel confident not only in my own skin, but then I feel confident to pursue these bigger goals and ideological, like kind of like positions that I think I can belong into, like medicine. And just along the way, I was just checking off different competitions, and gaining. I think it was Phil who first gained this idea of like kind of the cool runnings of Uganda and how cool would it be to go to the Olympics for the Ugandan team. So my outside community had seen this vision in me and talent that I had yet to see. I had seen the hard work and the ethics that it takes to get there and a little bit of the determination, but I had not seen the bigger picture that everybody started to see as I start to win competitions. And it's not until 17 when my rankings globally suffice to be able to say, oh wow, I can actually kind of qualify for the Olympics. I I, I can do something with this. But it was not planned out. I would like I would snowboard thinking like, well, at some point it's gonna end. So if it's gonna end, I really want to be so good. Nah, I'm gonna be goated. Going back to the core thing of like, nah, I'm not gonna be a punk. Like I'm gonna be one of the best because I know it's gonna end. Because a lot of people had this grasp to it of like, snowboarder, I gotta write for this person. I gotta do this and this trick, and you just see the anxiety. Like you see like the head just like
Yeah.
almost like cooking, you show up to like a huge event or you show up to Super Park, it's April, it's, springtime, everybody should be vibing. You're looking to your right, left. These dudes are just like gonna hit the 80-foot jump. I'm like, man, I don't know if I want to die today. I might hit
Yeah.
the 40-foot jump. I'm gonna do some stylish stuff. And then I might hit the 60-foot jump. Whoever sees is gonna see. Whoever doesn't see, oh, well. And I personally, deep down, know I can hit an 80-foot jump. I don't need to prove it to somebody. So for me, like when I was always in those situations, yeah, you got invited too. I'm like, yeah, my brother's here. So it was always that diverted, like, yeah, nah, I got invited probably because my brother's here and like he wants to snowboard. I'm just here to kick it with the kids. I'm here to kick it with the dudes. Piffing up. I don't know if I should say that. I don't know how professional your podcast is, but
There are
you
no
know,
rules.
no rules, you're pivoting up with people and you're just like, I'm here for friendship. I'm here to try to like, you should have seen me when I was 12, 13. I was just begging to be friends with everybody. You're my friend. Cool. And this kid next to me is like, you could see he's sweating, his body language. He's like trying to impress sponsors, trying to impress managers. I am not there to impress anybody because in the back of my head, I'm like, well, at some point I need to apply to medical school. And it was funny because whenever I go to Mass General in Massachusetts, I felt like those kids, you like tweak
Mm.
out. You didn't know if like you're saying the right thing. Are you reading correctly? Do you pronounce your answers right? So because of my demeanor of not wanting it as bad as my peers, I ended up always performing better because it's a mind
Uh,
sport, it's a psychological sport. The more you tweak out, the closer you are to death. The more you just like, I was like Blaze chilling, like, oh, you want to go hit this jump? Yeah. Oh, well, you want to do it 10? I'm like, I'll try. Before you know it, you're
Yeah.
spinning so much, you're up in the air, just spinning so fast, you land. You're like, people are like, dude, you know what you just did? You're like, I could not even tell you. I can't see myself do tricks, you know? I could feel it, but I don't know. It felt cool. And then you see it on video, and you're like, I remember first year filming with Burton, and I would see tricks that I was doing. I was like, damn, I wonder if this is what people see when they see me snowboarding. Like, I'm actually goated a little bit. But me personally, I've always, like, even on the Burton team, like, because I'm still in contract. You have Mark McMorris, you have Minsink, you have some of the best snowboarders in the world that when people are like, "Oh, you're on the Burton," I'm like, "Yeah, man." I'm probably here to crack the jokes and just kind of make the homies, feel good and like, I got a couple of tricks up my sleeve, but we got Mark McMorris right there. We have the best. So I always diverted that energy of like trying to be the best. And thank God I was never really good enough to be a premier pro. Like I became a premier pro, but internally I was never good enough to look at myself like I'm Mark Morris. I'm this person. I've always been like, oh man, I did snowboarding when I was young. I don't know. I don't know if I belong. I guess we're in Europe. I'm gonna do my best. Just shrug it off
Wow.
and you do your best. And I think the biggest lesson I learned from that in snowboarding is sometimes people like the atmosphere of other people, and community is more important than performance. Because the more chill I was, the more relatable I was, the more events I got invited to, the more places I got invited to, the better I just naturally got because I was just easily getting pulled up by some of the best. I remember the year Mark called me. He's like, "Yeah, are you gonna be in Switzerland?" I'm like, Did you get the wrong number?" Me? Like me? Like, yeah, man. I always also like offered and try to like work on people's bodies through their injuries and try to explain what they're going through. And I liked working out, avid, kind of gym goer, but like I just looked at it as like, nah, man, I could help you kind of come back from that. We'll get to cook it. I'll cook some meals for everybody. I just want to add on to the space, because from being a young child, if I add on to the space, back to the gyms, even back to like, I didn't do it as much with Chris Malika, but like the McMahon days and the Hessler days, the reason I'll keep getting invited after dinner, wash dishes, add on to the space. After this, I, I'll not take away from the vibe. I'll not bring no weirdness, and I'll just kind of sit back and just like that perfect dude that just you're kind of there. You crack a few jokes, but you're not trying to steal no one's girl. You're not trying to steal no one's thunder. You're not trying to steal no one's shine. You're just kind of there, and that has held my whole career to now. Like, I mean, I'm 30, and people still invite me to shit that I'm like, what?
Is that something that you consciously did in the moment, or is that something where you look back on it and you realize that that's what you did? Because somebody who goes and has a documentary made about them, and that documentary is globally successful and you get sponsorships, you mentioned Visa, Burton, so on and so forth. For most people, at some point that gets to their head and they become kind of what you described as, embodying, I'm the man, this, I'm that. And it sounds like that's not something that ever happened to you. And you see it as, a huge benefit to not just your career, but your skill and everything else.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that slowly I picked up and recognized. But like for you, you were probably seeing like, oh wow, you have this big documentation out, like you're traveling the world. The people next to me that I'm looking at is like, wow, you have a big movie out. I have a documentation in a film festival. You have a movie on a stage. Oh wow, you're this person. Oh wow, you snowboard. You had the cover of this. So for whatever success to me was success, and I was so glad I could never have words to convey that to whether it was my family or people that had known me prior. Coming back to Lincoln and having people, a moment where people are like, "Wow, Brolin, you're back in town. Hey, how you doing? You're here. Oh, how's school going?" People recognizing that I have a name, you actually belong. You used to live here with us. That did not happen to me on a daily basis because less and less people who would meet me at each fragment of my story did not know the prior version of me. You know, People that see me fresh off the boat in Lincoln only saw a small portion of that. The people that then got to see me kind of middle learning English to you going to prep school only got to see a fraction. So by the time I go to Wyoming, I recreate a new identity. By the time then I go onto Utah, you did not know my past where I did not hang my hat so much on my past. as much as my future. It was just kind of like, oh, who's Brolin? He's pretty cool, man. Yeah, he's a chill dude. We invite him to parties and everything. I'm like, yeah, I'm not getting invited to stuff. I'm not gonna blow that. Cool. Yeah, I'm just here, and that's it. And then as I've realized it, because Zeb Powell, who's a premier snowboarder now, one of the bigger stars, Zeb invited me for 6 years straight. Weirdest stuff, you know. Hey, we're going to New York for a Red Bull show. Hey, we're gonna go here and do this. And I never understood why, but then it dawned on me, I never wanted the access or the celebritism, and I was okay at being able to brush that off for me and allowing the stars shine. But I also never took away from their shine, you know, I never like stepped on people's toes. You know, when it
Hmm.
came time for Zeb to like shine, hey, yo, Zeb, like, what you need for me to get you ready? Just hang out right there. Ah, cool. You know, so it's like, I've recognized that, especially now that I'm down in Texas, I recognize it does not help you to be, I want the shine on me. And I think it hyphens the imposter syndrome and takes away from the bliss of you can just navigate the lay of the land and move from any group to other groups. And that was my beauty of Utah, because you would have a group that, well, we just want a black friend in there. Cool. I'm here. Well, bro, you can snowboard on a high level. Cool. I'm here. And once I moved down here, people are like, man, we just Googled you, you're an Olympian. I'm like, I don't want any of that. It changes and taints the way you and I are going to be able to connect. And I'm glad I never really, you know, hopped on like, hey, this is me. It would have taken away so many opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounded like, as you were explaining it, having medical school is something that was separate, and this, adjacent goal might have helped with that too.
It tremendously, tremendously helped. I think I thought about it recently because I'm coming up to, you know, renewal for a lot of my contracts, and I'm seeing the trajectory of the sport itself grow. You know, it's not no longer you wake up and you can hit a certain size of a jump and people are impressed, or you could do a double and people are impressed. Like there's some high consequence to it. You know, you gotta really fling yourself in the sky, and there's more. The global stage grew, so the identification of more and more talent grew because you're getting people from Slovenia, from random places that are as equally as talented as what we used to see back in the day from a smaller pool, but the purse and the rewards did not grow. So always having had the idea that, hey, no, I'm just snowboarding because I love it, allowed both the managers and myself to always kind of be attached to snowboarding, but not be attached to identity, especially because unfortunately, and maybe you experience this or not, there's a lot of suicide and a lot of whether it's addiction, suicide, traumatic injuries that occur within snowboarding. Some from my education or the little of that I have, I can attribute a lot of those from kids getting a lot of head injuries, a lot of head whips. You know, you hit your head a lot. I remember there was seasons that I would concuss myself several times, but I did not want to speak about it. Or whether kids grow up becoming, you know, the prodigy kid. You know, I know so many of them. Hey, you're a prodigy. You're so good. You're supposed Red Bull picked you up at 16. You're supposed to be here, but now you're 23. Now you've hit 25. Now you're not as so hot. And you're like, well, I used to be this person, but it's like, well, we were kids then, you know. You're now a normal individual. You and I go to the middle of Chicago, they're going to look at you as a 25-year-old. And as somebody in the middle of Chicago, you're going to be envious of them because as a 25-year-old, they're checking off societal boxes that maybe you feel like you're not checking off. So I hyperly always had that aware that in the end of the day, you're an immigrant's kid. Anything could happen and you'll be back to square one. Remember, you know, keep checking off societal boxes while you're living in this fantasy because it has been and it is a fantasy and a small bubble to be an action sport at professional, but it doesn't really resonate. And going back to the original of this story or the origins of this podcast, how do you originally transition into society, keep that identity of yourself, and society keeps up with you and stays formally interested in the next adventure that you're going to do? And how do you become grounded to that? You know, how do you become a civilian? Just like, you know, a soldier coming back from battle, how do you kind of share similarities with a normal civilian, but still be able to express that, hey, I maybe did experience this?
Really. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with like the ethos of what I want this show to be, which is exactly those transitions. I was in Kauai for Christmas and New Year's this past year. And they have this incredible wave, Hanalei Bay. And I was out there on a pretty good sized day. It was like overhead waves. And there was these two surfers who were just incredible. Most beautiful surfing I've ever seen. And after we were done, my girlfriend and I, we were at this like poke shop, and one of those people came in and was right behind us in line, and it took 45 minutes or something to get our food, and so we were just sitting there chatting with him. But um, I was talking with him about you're probably one of the best surfers I've ever seen. I bet he was in his fees or something like that. And he was explaining to me that back in the day, he was one of the guys at Pipeline, which is, a wave on Oahu that's very critical. And, on big days, it can be really dangerous, but it's also, beautiful. And I would imagine it's one of the most competitive places to be a surfer in the world. And he was talking about his experience of not being the guy, getting old and his body couldn't do it anymore, and being ashamed to paddle out there because he wasn't as good as he used to be. And the process of, I guess, kind of going into that civilian life, like how you described it, gracefully, and having to reframe things and so on and so forth. But he talked about friends having issues with suicide because of similar reasons. And that perspective that you have, Brolin, is so unique. Not many people, when they're at the peak of whatever their athletic ability is, are thinking about whatever's next. And, what can I do 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line or 25 years down the line? They're just enjoying that moment. And that's so cool that that's something that you had the foresight to see.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much. And I think maybe I've never really vocalized this out loud personally, but I think as I climbed the ladder of what I considered snowboarding success, and as you get older, you could kind of calculate where life is going and where your worth, both as a snowboarder and as an individual, is going. I think I escaped and went to school on the medical route as a way to solidify to myself that I can be good at other things and I could be great at things. And I've never really vocalized that, of maybe I started to get scared and think, okay, maybe I'm not as good as I truly am being embodied to be, and I think I am. Let me leave or at least have a segue before I'm kicked out of the cool kids club. Because I think once I've re-signed my contract with Burton, I signed like kind of a lengthy contract. Uh, and had conversations of what the future will be right after this contract. What will my future be? Obviously, it's action sports. And through those conversations, I was always cognitively aware of pacing, almost like back to always being in survival mode. I just, I realized that like in a few years, my body would give up on me and I would not be a Burton Premier Pro. And at some point, they would have to let me go. And what would my life be like now that I've, joined Burton, and I've never really told anybody that. Maybe a little bit with Phil, but like it's that fear of like, damn, you're coming from one of the best teams, and now you're gonna just go be a some average pro or go look for somebody else to sponsor you after they drop you. I'm not saying that they were in conversation of dropping me, but like you signed that last big contract with many years, and like, damn, is it gonna be the same like that? This looks too good to be true. So both of positively being aware, but also negatively being aware of my position. I decided before it was too late and before life and sport pulled the rug from underneath me to have to restart at sucking at something because medicine and kind of science and STEM and this side of things is also a very competitive side of things where people are prideful and have tried and grinded and crawled and scratched for so many years to get in the position they're in and want to be seen at such length and with such respect. And the reason really why I end up in Texas is I did not want anybody to know my past. I did not want to be close enough to a mountain or close enough to action sports. So within that culture where people can easily Google and piece things together and kind of question my reason of why exiting while you're still at the precipice and the top of your game. Because having not snowboarded at a younger age, I felt like I even the year I left, I was just getting better and better. And I never formally sat my team down or my managers down and told them how I was living. But I internally had one moment when we had snowmobiled 100 miles out, 4 in the morning, we're freezing. We're filming for the next movie. I'm building like, a 60-foot drop jump in the middle of like nowhere. Like we're out there, just satellite phone. And I just had this scary moment, like reality of I think life fully came in. I was like, whoa, like
Mm,
you could die. What are you doing? And what is life after this? What if you get injured? How, what if you want to get married? What if you want to build a house? How would you do that? I'm not saying that I would not have been able to do that through snowboarding and through the lens and the fame of snowboarding, but how would you sustain it in 35, 40, 45, 50? And once I started to have that conversation with myself, some people might look at it as honorable. Oh, wow, you're actually going to the second part of the career. Between you and I, truthfully, like I started to fear what life would be like without snowboarding if I had not taken a grip of the wheel and started to steer and control my life after. I did not want to turn out to be like a lot of the jaded pro snowboarders. Like this was your favorite
mhm.
pro. Now they're kind of working construction or really selling real estate. Maybe they sell a house or two. Yeah, maybe they have a comfortable stability of family life, married, whatnot. But deep down, you could see there's a light, there's a shine that is missing within their life. And because they were just hanging on for dear life for so long in this one avenue and realm of like living that they forgot that they might need to prepare for that next.
Yeah. Yeah. Sports at that level professionally, it almost exists separate from society. It's like your process of going out and doing whatever your sport is doesn't have the same connection to what's going on in the rest of the world because it really is binary. You're good enough or you're not good enough. You go out and you're doing your thing. It's not affected by what's going on in the news or it's not affected by, coworkers or anyone else. And I think you end up having this level of control that once you are no longer doing your sport at that level. It's like what you're describing. You really have to kind of like relearn, start from zero again. And for people who have been at the very, very top, all of a sudden, it's something that's really hard to do. So for you, while you're, I guess, 2017, things are starting to go really well with snowboarding. Are you still going to do things with medical school? It sounded like maybe you're going to Mass General. Are you in school at all?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been, thanks to Susan, I've always been kind of aware of the competitive lens that medicine had. And despite what you were doing or despite who you were, there's kind of there's the acceptance that you have to go through in the process. You're not being accepted based off what you're doing and who you are, but based off a certain criteria that you have. Everybody gets judged on. So while I'm doing that, I'm secretly, not even secretly, because my career is based out of Utah and University of Utah is there, and being at premier medical school, I applied to the MPH-MD program at University of Utah, and I start my master's in epidemiology, which you finish your master's and you start your MD. It kind of segues together. And I did that while I was on the road. And luckily at the time I was dating a girl that was really, really supportive, both, physically and mentally. So she was able to, she was more of a brainiac than I was. So she was always kind of, when you come home, you're not really looking into snowboarding. You're not watching snowboarding, footage and watching TV. You're kind of coming home to a different world, somebody who, thinks education is the way out of, her current situation and really envies and cherishes reading and kind of like cognitive conversations and challenging each other that way. So because of that, in the morning I was snowboarding. Midday, I'd go back and do the master's program and prepare for medical school and prepare for the MCAT and whatnot, and kind of keep my leg in school because I still had to prove to schools that like, hey, I'm both doing continuous education and I'm still eager and interested in STEM, and also I'm competitive enough or have competitive potential to be competitive and can handle the school load. So that's kind of how I continue to be able to do that.
And you're in Dallas now?
I'm in Dallas now. Texas. I'm in Texas now.
Wow, big switch up. So you graduate from University of Utah with your master's,
Hmm.
and now you're getting your doctorate.
Yes, sir.
So where are you at with that? Are you still in, study mode, doing tests and that sort of thing? Are you in clinicals? And
I mean, clinical year two, starting year two of clinical rotations. And then I have a heavy year. I mean, this fall is it's been very busy, 80 hours kind of type of vibe. Not all the time, but pretty much all the time you have to be thinking. But I have a year and a half, 2026. I should have all my licenses and all my doctoral, Medicare, Medicaid, insurance, whatnot, registrations. I should be fully done with the medical process. Obviously, always having to do continued education, but I should be done in 2026. I think your angelic mind wants you to kind of think you can and will be able to sustain the same level of pro-ship that you had before life. I think my view for snowboarding right now, a little less more of I'm chasing to be within the limelight of that guy, but I want to grandfather and age gracefully into the sport as a lifelong avid snowboarder. I spent so much time building the credibility and building the relationships that luckily snowboarding is like golf. It's something that takes such a long time to attain the skill set. Snowboarding has a shelf life. You also want to almost contribute to society. So I wanted to be able to add on to the community by coming in on the medical perspective of I understand the sport, I understand what it takes to get to the sport, I understand the mental space and headspace you need to be in. But now I know how to treat the athletes, I know how to treat the community surrounding the athlete, and I can contribute to whatever community I live in. But hey, I happen to be very good at snowboarding, and winter comes, it's 3 months out of the year. I'm going to chase winter around the world, but not necessarily sacrifice community for winter. So that's kind of where I've been able to have those conversations with some of my managers and some of my long life, sponsors. Like Jackson Hole is a good example. I've not lived in Jackson Hole for, man, over a decade, but I've been sponsored by Jackson Hole to this point because I still can add on to the community. I'm still a child of the high school and a child of the community, or um, a product of the community coming together and molding my career. And I still have attributes of being able to, kind of now, I'm playing the diversity card for the mountain and I'm not the super ultra billionaire guy. I'm your normal average guy. Like many of the people coming from Texas, I come from Texas. I'm here in the winter, but I work a normal job. So trying to instill myself in that. And luckily, snowboarding is a lot of transplants, what I like to call a lot of Texan Dallas transplants that go into the mountains when it's time to go to the mountains and come back down when it's time to be down here. But I envision myself opening a clinic and having a practice that is a part of the ethos of the action sports community.
incredible, Brolin. The vision is wild. The foresight,
Dreaming, man.
that is so cool.
Yeah, thank you.
Um, like what advice would you give to somebody like that?
I mean, there's so many parts to that advice, but the biggest advice is don't be afraid to restart and try something new and fail at that something new, because the same thing that made you great at that sport are the same attributes that you maintain and you're going to keep, and they're going to propel you into whatever new adventure that you're going to take on. I think a lot of us get so good at one thing and you get afraid of changing your identity or changing that one thing that you're good at and being bad at something else. But that same process that made you great at that one thing is the same process that's going to hold you and support you through the new adventure.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, Brolin, thank you so much for coming on.